Okay, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I am, I guess, the last speaker of the day, so I have a high bar to cross, which is to be interesting, which may be hard because I'm talking about the internet economy. But also, I think many of you are academics, I think scholars. I'm not. I have a PhD, but I really took that into the policy world. So a lot of what we do at ITIF is we take work from scholars who are writing about this, doing research on it, in a wide variety of areas around the innovation economy, and then try to translate that into language that policymakers can understand. Not to say that they don't read journal articles, but maybe not all the time, and they probably don't understand what regression analyses are. So we try to take that and put it into a context, and that's a little bit what I'm going to do today. So some of it may seem sort of high level, top level, shallow maybe, but I want to just kind of present kind of an overview of that. So ITIF, for those of you who don't know, we're a think tank. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary. And the goal really was to be a think tank that policymakers around the world could access for information and analysis and advice and ideas around how to grow their innovation economies. And one of the things we learned early on was that even though we're based in the US, that we would get delegations of policymakers coming through Washington, or we would get invited to come to other places. And invariably, people were dealing with exactly the same kinds of questions. How should we deal with this thing called net neutrality? What should we do about privacy? How do we make sure that we are taking advantage of the latest advances in IT, like IoT or Internet of Things? What's this thing called big data and data analytics and machine learning all about? So a lot of policymakers are grappling with the exact same problems, the exact same challenges, to be fair, in the context of their own political economy. But they're dealing with the same questions, and that's a lot of what we try to do is provide information and advice. So we do that around the world. Some places we haven't been to yet, but a lot of places we have, and we talk to people and we try to understand what's going on. So I really want to do 5 things today, and by the way, I'm certainly would like to leave a lot of time for questions or comments. If you have a burning one while I'm talking, just raise your hand. Productivity, the role of ICT, this notion, if you haven't heard it, sort of this famous quote, software is eating the world, by Mark Andreessen, who founded Netscape a few years ago, made this argument in the Wall Street Journal, and it's really, I think, a good description of what's going on. And then what's government's role in all of that? And finally, a little bit of discussion of how do we think about jobs in this? I think there's an enormous amount of anxiety about this new technology revolution and what it's going to do to the labor market, and I will talk a little bit about that. So when you think about Latin American, obviously Latin America has multiple economies, but think about Latin America as a group of economies. It has 2 major challenges. One is innovation. It innovates much less than the world leaders. There's a new book that just came out, Political Economy of Innovation, and talks about how countries like Taiwan and Singapore, South Korea, they all had the same per capita income as most Latin American countries did 40 or 50 years ago, but they have launched themselves into becoming global leaders. So innovation is one challenge. But the second challenge, which is related but not the same, and that's productivity. This chart is essentially showing the US in terms of output per worker. It's about $120,000 a year, and you can see the wide variety there among Latin American and Caribbean countries in terms of their productivity. Significantly lower, obviously. And then when you look at productivity growth trends, you see, again, a wide variety there. Ecuador, from 98 to 2008, did great. Uruguay's down, Venezuela's down. And then you look at it more recently, 2008 to last year, and you see a similar picture. Uruguay down even more, Ecuador down now, but lots of sort of movement all around, no kind of consistent level. And what's really troubling is that when you look at the other data on multi-factor productivity, Latin America has not gained on the United States in 40 years. If I were in Latin America, that would be one of the main things I'd worry about at night, because when you're not at the forefront, when you're not at the lead in global technology, where for the United States to gain productivity, we have to invent something. We have to push the envelope. We can't just sort of take stuff that's already been done and apply it. We're already there. But for countries in Latin America, you have this huge array of technologies and business models and all these other things that the leaders have put in place. So your productivity should be growing twice as fast as US productivity, easily. And it hasn't been. And I think that's, to me, the major economic challenge, or a major economic challenge going forward. So what's the role of ICT in that? There's an awful lot of evidence. First of all, I'll just start by saying, where does productivity come from? When you really look at the evidence in the literature, particularly what's called new growth theory, Paul Romer and Darren Essegemblou and other people who are thinking about the role of innovation in growth theory, it really comes from new tools. So there's a great line by Paul Romer when he was at Stanford. He said, what would you rather have today? Would you rather have the tools of 2016 with the skills of 1916, or the skills of 2016 with the tools of 1916? I think the answer is you would rather have the tools, because you can get the skills, but if you don't have the tools. So the tools account for about 80% of productivity. Skills and capital, about 20%. Now, it's not to say that skills aren't integral in going together, but the fact that if you have advancements in tools and tool use, in other words, capital investment, that's how you grow productivity. Today's driving tools are ICT tools, software, hardware, communications. Those are the tools that are really having the biggest impact within organizations and enterprises on productivity. So the real question, I think, for a lot of countries and a lot of policymakers is, okay, I want to grow. What's the best way to grow? Should I try to get myself a semiconductor firm? Should I try to get myself a software firm? Or should I try to get all of my firms in all of my industries, from agriculture all the way up to services? Should I try to get them to be robust ICT users? And the answer from an array of scholarly literature in country after country is that over 90% of the benefits you get from ICT in any national economy are from its use, not from its development. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean you shouldn't care about the development. You shouldn't care about seeing if you can grow some software companies or some device companies or whatever those might be. But if you're a policymaker and you think that you're going to have that be the engine for your economy, I think you'll be sorely disappointed. Now, the reason this is important is, as I'll talk a little bit later, some of the policies that you might want to use for cooking actually hurt eating. So it'd be one thing if you could just say, oh, let's put in place a bunch of policies like, for example, better computer science education. That's an unalloyed good that helps eating and cooking. But high tariffs on ICT imports, that helps your cooking, because maybe your domestic IT firms are a little protected and maybe they can gain a little more market share, but it hurts eating because it raises prices. So sort of keep that in mind as we go along. So a few studies, I mean, I could list a whole bunch more, and there are hundreds more from many, many other countries, but overall study, I think the World Bank did a 10% increase in ICT capital stock, grows GDP 0.45%. Another study just came out from the Inter-American Development Bank looking at broadband, had a significant impact on productivity in firms in Latin America. A Colombian study on manufacturing found that Colombian firms that used more ICT had significantly higher labor productivity. Another study of Chilean manufacturing and service firms found the exact same thing. So there seems to be kind of a universal understanding or findings, I should say, that firms that adopt more ICT get more bang for the buck. They get higher productivity. Now, what I didn't put on this slide, which I should have, is there's a bunch of interesting research from McKinsey Global Institute, Eric Bernolfson at MIT, in the Sloan School there, where when you look at companies and you look at the benefits they get from ICT usage, whether that's software adoption or hardware or whatever it might be, there's essentially, it's hard to describe it, but it's basically, think about a 4-cell quadrant. If you're having high ICT adoption in your firms, and the firms are adopting digital practice, best practice business models and business practices, that's where you get significantly higher gains in productivity. So in other words, it's not just getting firms to adopt ICT, they have to use the ICT to transform their business models. Some of those things are devolving authority down farther from the top line because ICT gives workers more tools, digitizing every single process, using ICT for accountability. And Bernolfson's book goes through an awful lot of those to look at that. But the key there, I think, is that many, many companies think about ICT and using it just as, well, I'm going to use ICT, and they don't use it to transform their business models. There was a very good study that John Van Reenen at London School of Economics and Nick Bloom at Stanford did, where they looked at essentially British firms, UK firms in the UK, and American firms in the UK. And they controlled for differences in size and industry and all that, so they tried to get matched pairs, if you will. And they said, what's the difference in the use of ICT and the benefits of ICT? And what they found was that the US firms didn't invest any more in the UK than the UK firms invested. The UK banks invested the same amount, the American banks over there, American insurance, whatever. But the American companies got significantly more bang for the buck. They got more benefit from the ICT they used than the British firms did. And that really boiled down to essentially a different approach to management and a willingness to use ICT to disrupt business models and, frankly, to disrupt work. The British firms were more reluctant to use ICT to just sort of destroy whole kinds of work processes and, frankly, lay workers off, and the Americans were more willing to do that. So it depends what you want. If you want high productivity and you want your firms to be productive and profitable and competitive, you really want the American model. If you want stability, the British model is an okay one. It just doesn't get you as many of the benefits. So the point of all that is ICT usage in enterprises and organizations broadly defined is really, really important, but it has to be combined with the kind of the right work practices and management practices. Okay, so where are we going with all this? We hear a lot of talk about the cloud and these other technologies, and I guess the real question is kind of what's happening right now. And what appears to be happening right now is sort of two things, I think. At one level, there's a whole set of technologies that are, if you will, sort of maturing and somewhat up on the top of the S-curve. And I would put broadband there. For those of you who remember, when we all had, any of you young people may not remember this, but if you remember dial-up modems, you'd sit there and the thing would make the noise and it would be 26 kilobits a second. And it would take forever to have even a sort of just text website come up. So it was a huge deal when we went to always-on modems through broadband. It wasn't dial-up. And you went from 26 or 56K 100 times faster to 5 megs. I mean, that was just revolutionary. And at home, we had slow broadband the other night for some reason, so I rebooted the router, and then I tested it. And I was getting 50-50, but I was getting 50 down, 50 up. And it was like, that's a long, long way from the dial-up modem era. But my point is, I just don't know that going to 100 or going to 200 or going to a gig, we're not going to really notice it that much, at least with the present technology. So with a technology like broadband, we're kind of there. Now, to be fair, a lot of places, don't get me wrong, a lot of places don't have 20 megabit broadband symmetrical to the home or to business. But as a technology, the technology is close to the top of the S-curve. I would argue the same thing with the processor in this device. You know, the Apple 7, I guess, whatever, Apple 7. Is it, you know, I bought this because it was bigger, but you remember when a new phone would come out, you would buy it immediately because it was so much better. And today they're kind of eking out little tweaks, little things that are different, a few things here and there. The size is a little better, the battery life is a little better, but not revolutionary like the way it was for many, many years. So part of the system, I think, is in that environment. I think cloud is in that environment too. Now, to be fair, lots and lots of enterprises still haven't moved to the cloud, which is a surprise to me because the cloud is so much easier and so much cheaper. But it's there, it's not going to change that much. I think what's going to change, though, are these technologies. These are technologies that are largely at the beginning of the S-curve. They're not really all that powerful yet. They're pretty expensive and they're a little clunky, but they're getting better a lot. They're getting better quite quickly. So artificial intelligence, we're just seeing breakthroughs in that constantly. There was just an article today about how NASA is using AI for all sorts of different kinds of land exploration. IoT, again, I think IoT is one of the things where maybe the technology's here, but we just haven't used it very much. And we're going to have the Internet of Things. We're going to have what people call Industry 4.0. We're going to have Agriculture 4.0. We're going to have Transportation 4.0. We're going to have Healthcare 4.0. We're going to be transforming lots and lots of sectors with this technology. Robotics, again, I think robotics to me is probably the most important, that and AI are the most important technologies of the next 15 years. We're poised for a major global robotics revolution, which is really going to restructure a lot of work. And it's going to put places, I think, in an interesting little conundrum because with robotics, you don't mind higher wages. You don't like them, but you don't mind them. The way you did when everything was hand assembled, you really wanted to go to a low-cost place. But with robotics, it means that a lot more work can go back to higher cost locations, which is an interesting conundrum for Latin America. Latin America is generally not low cost, not high cost. Sort of where does it all fall when it comes to using these technologies? Again, 3D printing is really interesting. 3D printing is going to enable a lot more customization. You might, instead of having, 10 million of these printed, you'll have your own, somebody might print 100 of them. And again, that's going to move production back to more closely to located where markets are. Okay, so I'll stop there, just saying these are interesting technology wave that's coming up, and I think we don't know kind of the implications either about economic geography. We can sort of have some assumptions about economic geography. As I said, I think one of the assumptions will be that this next wave will be more friendly to high-cost places and more friendly to localized production than it was in the past. So, again, as I mentioned, Mark Andreessen, the founder of Netscape, coined this term, software is eating the world. And when you look at what Silicon Valley was doing in 2000, a colleague of mine, Dave Moschella, a thing called Leading Edge Forum, did a little analysis of this. Virtually every firm in the Valley in 2000 was in the information industry. They were making software, they were making hardware, they were making printers, they were doing databases, they were doing something related to the information industry. Today, about half of the companies in Silicon Valley are not in the information industry. They're in finance, they're in transportation, Uber, they're in hotel rentals, Airbnb. They're in this thing called Zenefits, which is automating benefit delivery for small companies, a big industry where lots and lots of people go out with small companies and help them with their benefits. That company's automating it. Coursera, a company that's trying to automate, if you will, higher education. So a big portion of what's happening now in the tech space are tech companies going into somebody else's industry and eating that industry, disrupting that industry and trying to capitalize on it. And that has, I think, really, really big implications, again, about where things are going to be. Now, if you think about an industry that every local economy could rely on for a long, long time, it was the taxi industry. You know, you got a bunch of taxis, they charge you too much, and they have really bad service, but you don't really have any choice because they're sort of use their political power to manipulate regulators, and the owners all live locally. Now you've got Uber, and a lot of that value, first of all, goes to the consumer, because Uber is so much more efficient. The amount of time an Uber driver has in the US with a person in the car is about 40% more than the time a cab driver has someone in the car. Uber drivers just, they let somebody out, somebody comes in, and so they're really, really efficient, and they actually get paid more than cab drivers, but some of that money leaves the local community and goes off to Silicon Valley. So what we're seeing are a whole bunch of new industries that are now becoming globalized, that used to be local, and now they're becoming global, and that has, I think, important implications. But the second big implication here, really, I think, is about productivity. All of these industries have the potential to really disrupt and get rid of a lot of work in the middle and dramatically raise productivity. So, if you're a country and you're a policymaker or an academic advising policymakers, what do you want to do? I think a couple of principles. One, I think we need to put enterprises first. And by that, I don't mean subsidize them or anything like that. But when you're in a country where your productivity is relatively low, you're not going to have a lot of people using the internet because a lot of people don't have money. I've been in meetings where there's a discussion about how do we get people with $5 a day to use the internet. Good luck with that, because they're going to spend that money on food. The goal should be to get them $100 a day. Then they're going to use the internet. And the way to do that is to really focus on enterprises first. Get more and more companies to be able to use ICT effectively, to be able to raise productivity, which then translates into higher wages and or lower prices. So that's things like making sure that your broadband providers, your broadband policy, really do a good job of serving enterprises. It's surprising in many places how bad enterprise broadband is. I remember a number of years ago we did a little study of hotel technology in downtown Washington, and this was, I have to grant, a few years ago, but the hotels would wait until 3 in the morning to upload their data to corporate headquarters because they didn't want to overload the internet. You know, now they don't have to worry about that. But so focusing on making sure enterprises have good broadband, tax policy so that companies do, and critically ICT skills so that enterprises can have the skills they need to use that. The last thing I just say on that, by the way, is really about the cloud. There's a study that I was a reviewer of, the US government did, and it was a really interesting study in the sense of it showed that with the cloud, you really don't need, enterprises don't need as many skills as they used to have to have. When you had your own server, you had to figure out all this stuff. Now with the cloud, it's much more plug and play, and it really, I think, to me, opens up a huge opportunity for enterprises that aren't very sophisticated to be able to seem like they're sophisticated because they're able to use the cloud. Second thing is scale. I had a debate with a guy, and one of Bill Clinton's advisors on technology, internet policy back in 1995. I don't want to sound like I'm tooting my own horn, but it makes my point. We had a debate, and I said, look, in 20 years, the average firm size in the US is going to have gone up because of the internet. He said, no, you're completely wrong. The internet is enabling mom and pops to sell anywhere in the world. The average firm size will go down. I wish I had bet him a lot of money because average firm size is up 16% in the US. I was right. And the reason average firm size goes up is just look at Amazon. Just one example of that. You know, we've lost thousands and tens of thousands of small retailers in the US. We've lost tens of thousands of small bookstores, travel agents, you name it. These local, small, mom and pop businesses are no longer, I mean, there's still some there, but the number of them has gone dramatically down because it is so much easier to provide these kinds of products and services using ICT-based scale. And that's why I think it's so important that countries really think about how to do this. Again, one of the great things about IT is that if you build a system, you can amortize those costs for free for a long, long time. It costs the small company the same as it costs the big company. Now, again, cloud's one interesting differential there. You build the cloud and anybody can use it. But even with the cloud, enterprises still spend a lot of money building their IT systems, and so it just enables scale economies to happen. This, I think, is a particular challenge for Latin America. The blue line is essentially the productivity of the smallest 10% of firms in the United States and Latin America relative to the productivity of the top 10% of firms. So in the United States, in any industry, on average, the best firms, the best 10% of firms have let's say a productivity rate of 100, and the worst have a productivity output of 50. So they're half as productive. In Latin America, the worst firms are 10% as productive as the leaders are. So you remember that slide I had back there at the beginning about low productivity in Latin America? A lot of that is due to that factor. There are just so many firms that are so far from the frontier here. The orange line is the average firm size. So the average firm size in the US is 1, let's say. Let's say it's, I don't know, I can't remember what it is. Let's say it's 300 workers. In Latin America, it's 150. Here's an interesting stat for you. Everybody remember what mode is? Okay. The number where the more numbers are on top and fewer numbers, same numbers are on the bottom. Not average, but mode. The modal size of a US manufacturing firm is 40. In other words, half of US manufacturing firms have more than 40 workers and half have fewer than 40 workers. Anyone want to guess what the modal firm size of Mexican manufacturing firms are? 1. Half of the firms have 1 or less employee, and half have more than 1. So the fact that ICT really enables scale, and that scale enables productivity, suggests that Latin American policymakers need to think differently about small business. I hear all the time, you go to countries and small businesses are the source of all great things, and mom and pop and all that stuff. Yeah, not really. Small businesses pay less, they have fewer benefits, they have lower productivity, they export less, they have less innovation, as a general rule. So I think the policy there means to think, let's think more carefully about size distribution in economies. So I think that means, number one, reduce subsidies and regulatory preferences for small firms. There's a very good study that a scholar, professor in Argentina sent me. Argentina is a very interesting country because it's one of the only countries in the world that had negative productivity growth for the grocery store industry. You really have to work hard to get negative productivity growth over 10 years in the grocery store. The Russians had 5% a year growth in productivity in the grocery store industry. Argentina had negative. Why did they have negative? They essentially made it so difficult for big firms to expand through zoning, through restrictive regulations, through tax policies, and they did nothing to regulate small firms who were abusing things like selling stuff that was 5 months old and should have been taken off the shelf, and not paying their workers minimum wage, and all these other things. So the point is, I think we should move to size neutrality. The other component there, and that's really about market size. One of the great advantages the US has in this space, I was over in France last year, and I was talking to a really interesting accelerator or incubator the government has helped establish for the software industry in Paris. And I was asking the guy there, I said, how's it going? What are you dealing with? He said, well, look, we've got some really great firms, some really great innovations coming out of our universities. We're commercializing them. We've got great entrepreneurs. We're getting them in the marketplace. But After a year that we're there, we got about a third or a quarter or a fifth of the customers our American competitors have, because they're scaling in a huge national market. We're scaling in France, a little bit of the rest of Europe. And by the time we're at that point, they've got such an insurmountable lead, partly because of these scale effects, partly because of consumer lock-in and other kinds of things, that it's really hard to compete. And I think that says a lot about Latin America. I mean, you at least have an advantage. When you go to Europe, the Swedish don't speak French and the French don't speak Greek. They sort of try to all speak English, but you all, with the exception of Brazil, in theory, all speak Spanish. So you should have this great giant market that's available to you. And to me, again, that's partly a political challenge. Are there things that you can do to create more integrated markets so that a startup firm in Costa Rica can scale, not just in Costa Rica, but in every Latin American country at once, and get in there and understand that the rules are going to be understandable. There aren't going to be barriers to doing that. All right, another principle is really about embracing disruption. And I think this is a really, really hard one for Latin America sometimes. I don't know where that Uber thing is, but probably France, because they hate Uber drivers over there. Actually, Uber drivers over there don't even have Uber on their windows because they're afraid of getting beaten up. Seriously. But I think the point here is you can't really get innovation unless you're willing to allow technology that's taken by new firms or existing firms that want to disrupt other firms and let it happen. You know, look, I don't know how long it's going to take here, but you know, in 10 years in the US, the cable TV industry, the sort of you know, direct multi-channel video channels that people subscribe to, it'll be really, really a small industry. That's my prediction. Maybe it's 20 years, but at some point in time, it'll all be over the top. It'll just be all over the top. The only reason you had cable TV, sort of a dedicated wire that goes in there and you could watch certain things, the only reason you had that is you didn't have technology that allowed you to watch anything you wanted to at any time. The technology didn't exist. So they would stream channels that you could watch. Now they don't have to do that. And so if you're a country, you're like, do I want to defend the cable monopoly and just sort of try to keep Netflix and other competitors out? Or do I just want to say, let's have a level playing field and let consumers decide how that's all going to play out? That's generally what we're doing in the U.S. In fact, if anything in the U.S., the U.S. FCC, Federal Communications, is actually tilting towards over the top, which is another story. But the point is, to be an innovation leader, or at least not to be a laggard, you have to be open to embracing disruption. Okay, so what can government do? I think a few things government do. Number one is just put growth first. Put technology-enabled growth first. I'm really struck by, if you've read the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they're really good goals, really important goals. There's 17 of them, I believe. However, 17 goals, and not one of them says, let's raise growth in poor countries. Not one of them. So we need a goal 18 that says, if you're a developing country or you're sort of at half of what the US productivity level is, you ought to set a goal of doubling your productivity in 15 years. That's perfectly doable with about a 5% productivity growth rate a year. And so I think, again, unless policymakers say that's what they want, it's going to be a lot harder to do. Secondly, as I said before, really think about innovation in all industries. It's not enough to have a laptop assembler. And I know in one Latin American country I won't name, they forced a company to come in that makes kiosks for going to the bank. They made them come in and open up a factory. Look, unless you have, I'll skip that, unless you have innovation in all industries and IT, you're not going to do well. A third one is don't raise ICT costs. Now you'd think that's kind of a no-brainer, like, yeah, I want firms to adopt and I want consumers to buy this stuff. Why would I go and do it? Why would I raise ICT costs? Well, a whole boatload of countries do that. This was a study we did ranking 126 countries on how much added cost, not the VAT, which applies to everything, but special costs either through tariffs or special ICT taxes do they add to these products? The reason I did that study is I was in Brazil and I was talking to somebody. I said, how often do you get to the US? They said, oh, we go to Miami all the time to buy iPads and, computers. I said, why do you go to Miami to buy that stuff? He goes, well, the government puts huge tariffs on it and taxes on it. So it's a lot cheaper for us to get on a plane, go to Miami, and buy the stuff. So that's really a simple thing. Columbia really did, I think last year, year before, did a big revamp, really did a great job reducing these taxes and tariffs. But again, simple thing a country can do. Another thing countries can do is really just try to think about the kind of business model burdens and limitations. And I'll start with privacy. I think the debate that we have, or a lot of countries have, is you either have a regime with very heavily regulated privacy where you can't do anything with the data, or you have this free-for-all where nobody has any privacy. This is generally how the Europeans and the European Commission thinks about the world. There's a very good study by Catherine Tucker at MIT who did a study of the European Privacy Directive, and she found that because the restrictions on using data are so onerous that the ability to make money through eyeballs, so most internet stuff is free. It's not government subsidized. Internet applications are free because people make money on the advertising. The ability to do that in Europe is constrained by about 60%. So it's about 60% less effective. The ads, you get 60% less money in Europe than you do in the US. So I think the key here is think about how you can have reasonable privacy rules, particularly through opt-in, that are strongly enforced, but that at the same time give your internet companies the ability to use data in effective ways, particularly around innovation. Restrictive product and service market regulations. Again, lots and lots of studies on that. World Bank, a whole bunch of studies on that that show that labor market regulations significantly reduce ICT uptake. In Europe, for example, in some countries, it's very, very hard to fire somebody. And not surprisingly, firms don't adopt a lot of IT. Why would you adopt IT if you can't fire somebody that you don't need anymore? Also, product market regulations. Again, I think there's a lot of push in some places to, well, let's see, this sort of sounds like it's a voice call because I'm on Skype, so I better regulate Skype like I regulate circuit switch telephony. I just don't think that's the right thing to do. That Skype is a completely different animal. It's using internet protocols, it's over the top, it's not the same. So I think it's a huge mistake to sort of take a lot of these emerging internet applications and put the same burden that you would put on legacy incumbent applications. If anything, think about, again, the US, I think, is a model here. We took away regulations on things like text messaging. Okay. And then just the last one, really think about making government a force for digital innovation. Governments can do a lot. UK, for example, I think was one of the leaders on that. They created a thing called Government Digital Services, which is really this innovative arm within the UK government to digitize government services. Every agency in every country ought to be charged with having an IT-led innovation plan. Every agency ought to have a chief innovation officer that thinks about how that agency can be innovative and how, when they touch other parts of the economy, they can make sure that they help support innovation. And lastly, digitize every process that can be processed. There's just an enormous set of things we do, and countries still do, that are not digitized, even in the US. One of Secretary Clinton's proposal, we just released a big report on Monday comparing the Trump and Clinton technology proposals. The short answer is Clinton's, there were a lot more of them. But one of her things is to digitize like the most used processes in the federal government. Okay, let me just close by saying, what does that all mean for jobs? So we're going to have this big technology revolution. What's going to happen? When you go out and you look at the debate on jobs and technology, it's sort of this weird debate. People don't even, I think, understand that sometimes you read articles in the New York Times that incorporate both sides without even understanding that both sides cannot be true. So one side, emblematic by a US economist at Northwestern, Robert Gordon. Bob Gordon writes this book, I encourage you to read all 800 pages of it, basically saying there's no more growth. Technology is over. We've picked all the low-hanging fruit, and there's really nothing on the horizon. So I'll give you one little anecdote from Bob's book, which I think will tell you my view of his book. He has a discussion in there of autonomous vehicles. self-driving cars, which will happen at some point, probably longer than we think because the technology, you can't have a self-driving car that kills people only every 400 days. It has to kill people almost never, and that's hard to do. But it'll come. And when it does, the estimates of a study we did and multiple other studies show $1 trillion a year economic benefit in the US. $1 trillion a year. Most of that from reduced accidents, medical costs, disability, and car wrecks. A bunch of it also due to increased throughput on the roads. $1 trillion a year. In Bob's book, he says that there is zero economic benefit from self-driving cars because the only thing you can do is read your email while you're driving. So, I think that this sort of side is just really off, doesn't quite get it. There's another side, which is that we're in this kind of new era, bigger than the first industrial revolution. It's Eric Bernofson's book, The Second Machine Age. Technological progress is improving exponentially. The only thing I'll just say to that is it's not. He bases that on what's called Moore's Law, which is the notion that semiconductor processes double in power every 18 months. In fact, Moore's Law has been slowing down significantly for the first time since the invention of the transistor, or the integrated circuit. We've seen an increase for the last 2 years in price per MIPS, million instruction per second. So Moore's Law is not just keeping doing that. It's going to hit a plateau in 5 or 10, probably 5 years, and things will slow down. So I think the real question is kind of where are we on all this? And I think this may be one way to think about it is if for any of you in there who are sort of long-wave Schumpeterians, this is really what that's thinking about, which is that this is again sort of Chris Freeman, Carlotta Peret's work on takeoff, installation, slowdown. We're sort of in that period, I think, we're sort of up here with the digital IT system, digital electronic technologies making this huge, massive effect, but we're kind of near the top of that for some of these technologies, and I think that's a big part of why we're seeing a global slowdown in growth, not just in the US, but around the world, really about productivity growth rates of about half of what they were a decade ago. But I think what people are missing is there is this new system that will probably come on board, come online, and that system promises an enormous set of capabilities. The only thing is, it's not here yet. And so I think it'll be here sort of 10, 15 years, 10 maybe if we're good, 15 if we're not. And that means, though, for a country, you need to be thinking about preparing for this wave now. If you're worried about trying to build a semiconductor plant, you've already lost that war. That's not what's happening. It's about what's happening here that I think is going to be the most important thing. And at some point when that happens, we will see, I think, a big uptick in productivity. So what does that mean for jobs? I think what it means for jobs is we shouldn't worry about the number of jobs. Okay, there's two arguments that I think people make, and only one of them is valid. One argument is we're going to get just structurally high levels of unemployment. So there are people in the US and elsewhere, the UK, who argue we'll get 50% unemployment. For those of you who are economists, you know the term lump of labor fallacy, which means if in the lump of labor fallacy, you destroy a job, it's gone forever and there's nothing to replace it. The lump of labor fallacy is a fallacy because every time productivity goes up, one of three things happen. Wages go up, prices go down, or profits go up. One of those three things happen. Has to. And that money then gets spent and translated into economic growth. Let me ask you a question. Anybody in this room, if your income were to triple in the next 3 years, would anybody in the room worry that you wouldn't have enough things to spend on? Yeah, because I think our human needs are pretty big. I saw on the plane coming down here, there was a little advertisement for one of those like swimming pools in your backyard. I thought, that's kind of cool. I'd love to have one of those. I don't have any money to do it, but if somebody were to triple my income, I might get one of those swimming pools in my backyard. So my point is, money doesn't get thrown away. It gets recycled in the economy. People then buy new things because they want things. They want to send their kids to college. They want to go on a vacation. They want to get better health care. That's going to keep happening for a long time. What I think will happen, though, is occupational disruption. That's real, and that's what we should be worrying about. We shouldn't worry about not enough people having jobs. As long as you have a reasonable macroeconomic policy and don't do like crazy things like this country to the south of us who starts with a V, where you drive your economy into the toilet because you're doing dumb things. Yeah, if you don't do that, you're going to have enough jobs. The real issue is, can you deal with transitions? And that's really, a lot of that is about skills and making sure that people have the right generalized set of skills that they are going to need to be able to make those transitions. So, does IT productivity still benefit workers? I'll kind of skip that. The answer is yes, but some mythologies. Thomas Piketty says it doesn't. Some of the more recent studies, Federal Reserve Bank and others show, yeah, it still does. And I'm going to skip that one in the order for the sake of time. That's our book if you want to look at it. And I'm happy to take any comments or questions you have. So thank you.